Having taught international relations quite some time, I wanted to really focus on a few core aspects of realism. And the most important aspect of realism is order and stability. Unlike governments, the international community does not have a central authority to protect everyone. There is no central government. So survival really depends on a state's material capabilities. What this means, it's essentially a self-help system. International relations is a self-help system. Everybody looks out for each other. And for classic realists in particular, international relations is an expression of human drives and subject to the same pathologies. Nobody trusts one another. What are the central concepts of realism? Number one, states have a vital interest in international relations and are the only ones entitled to have them. Number two, realism perceives the world through the concept of interest understood in terms of power. To realists, power is the only tool to resolve difference. Number four, because of that, conditions of scarcity or uncertainty may lead to conflict between states, even if those states don't seek conflict. Number five is what I call the Las Vegas rule. Whatever happens in a state stays in a state. The focus here is on the autonomy of the political realm and decisions made within it. States don't care about what's happening in other states. And number six, the issue of relative gains. States will always worry about how much the other side will gain. Will they have a bigger share of the pie and will shift the balance of power in its favor? These are the six most important aspects. Now, within this world, states basically have two choices. Number one is balancing, and number two is bandwagoning. So number one, states have two options. One is external balancing. That means form an alliance. That reduces the costs needed for a state to devote to security, but it also bears risks because we don't know whether the other state will come to your rescue. And then the second option is internal balancing. That means building up arms, building up larger and better military forces in order to protect yourself. Now, in a bipolar world where we have two superpowers, states only have one option, and that is internal balancing. Now, during the Cold War, we had NATO, we had the Warsaw Pact, but the two superpowers really only relied on their own resources by building up military means. Now, the second choice is bandwagoning. States here join forces with a rising state, a state that is winning wars, that is gaining power, as opposed to balancing alliances where the states join the weaker side. States generally prefer to balance in international relations because they do not want to be the vulnerable party to a powerful partner. And this effectively leads to balance of power. So balances of power tend not to form because states necessarily desire a balance, but rather because states try to offset others' power advantages and to gain advantages of their own to protect themselves. With states acting and reacting to offset advantages in power, balances of power tend to form. Now, let's look at balance of power. Balance of power is an incredibly important aspect of realism. Individuals, groups, and states, we all protect themselves from predators. And international relations is no exception. At the international level here, balance of power has also contradictory implications for peace. On one side, it might deter war if status and quo powers outgun imperialists or troublemakers. They show them, we mean business. Don't challenge the status quo. They demonstrate their resolve that they will defend themselves. But balancing can also intensify tensions and make war more likely because of the impossibility of properly addressing the motives, capabilities, and resolve of other states. We don't really know what the other state is up to, and this is what we call the security dilemma. Now let's look more closely at order. As I said, order is very important to realism. Realism in the context of the Cold War was a plea for statesmen and above all Americans and Soviet leaders to recognize the need to coexist in a world of opposing interest and conflict. The security could never be fully guaranteed, only approximated through a fragile balance of power and mutual compromise that might resolve or at least diffuse the arms race and the potential of the various regional conflicts which they had become entangled. So we had restraint and partial accommodation were the most practical short-term strategies for preserving the peace during the Cold War. Now lastly, we have two subfields of realism, structural realism or neo-realism. So structural realism and neo-realism, we're looking at the constraints and opportunities created by a state's international environment they are the key to understanding its behavior. States that are interested only in maintaining sovereign control of the territory can also end up in an arms race and war because of the pressures created by anarchy of the international system. So even these states are only security seekers and they only want to maintain the status quo, they might still be drawn into war because of structures. So war can happen between rational security seekers because the international system generates insecurity and drives them into competition. Now, lastly, motivational realism, that really emphasizes the importance of states that have an inherent desire to expand for explaining international competition and conflict. They're also called greedy states. They're interested in territorial expansion, even when they're secure in the status quo. So the international environment is not necessarily unimportant to motivational realists, but it's considered the sole source. The motivations are considered the sole source of conflict. Now, perfect examples of order stability would be the concept of Europe. There was agreement and arrangement between the great powers between 1814 and 1914. And it was almost 100 years of relative peace with a few minor conflicts throughout that. So it was a century of stability. What now would be called the Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich's strategy was to maintain a sufficient balance of power to ensure system stability rather than trying to defeat a specific foe. Everybody was part of that concept of Europe. Looking at fast-forwarding to Kissinger and Nixon, Kissinger, considered Metternich to be a statesman of the equilibrium, seeking security and a balance of forces. A scientist of politics permitted no sentimental attachments to interfere with his measure. So that's really the motivation for Kissinger when he came up with Détente in 1972. So improving relations with China as the United States was conducting tough negotiations with the Soviet Union. The goal was stability, not defeat of the Soviet Union. Was using the thaw of relations with China to use against the Soviets. So the idea here, diplomacy must be divorced from moralistic and meddlesome concerns with internal policies of other nations. Here's the Vegas rule again. But stability ought to be the primary goal of diplomacy. And lastly, looking at Iran policy under Obama, that led to the nuclear deal of 2016, it was a very much power-based exercise by the United States. It was a departure from previous policies of kind of bring the Iranian government to its knees, but rather bring it into an acceptable arrangement where the Iranians were comfortable enough to make concessions. These were reciprocated by the Europeans and Americans, Russians and Chinese. So it was a very intrusive inspections regime for the nuclear deal. But it was based on a balance of power. It was very much a power-based exercise under the Obama administration. If you want to know more about offensive and defensive realism, please look at my other video.